Hi, my name's Gary Nation. I'm a senior security engineer at Tenable based in the UK. And the subject of today's technical talk is to dive into how Tenable delivers a risk-based vulnerability management solution. Historically, when businesses have asked the question, how secure are we? In the vulnerability management world, we tend to provide long technical reports, that details how many vulnerabilities we have, how many criticals, how many highs, how many mediums. And what this almost always ends up doing is creating a very large, very technical, very detailed report, which really has very little value in itself. No one is going to look through a 300-page plus document to answer this question. So several years ago at Tenable, we set out to start to create solutions to really address this fundamental problem that we were seeing in all of our customers, whereby the CISOs, and the more executive type of business leader really needed a quantifiable, measurable metric that they can leverage to track and compare their security posture against other organizations. Behind all of this, within our cloud platform, we leverage something which we call exposure.ai. This isn't a product, this isn't anything that we sell. It's just a name that we use for the data lake that sits on the back end that powers this. But really what this is doing is that within our platform, we're constantly analyzing millions of data points. So for every vulnerability, and we've got something like over 55,000, unique specific vulnerabilities tracked in the platform. And then every night, a machine learning algorithm runs across that data set and then says, what's happening in the real world? Are threat actors actively exploiting each one of these vulnerabilities? Is there malware actively leveraging these vulnerabilities? And we look at a whole over 10 different threat providers. So we leverage open source threat intelligence, we leverage some commercial threat intelligence providers, we leverage our own research that creates over 9,000 specific sources of threat information. And each one of those 9,000 sources we can look at and say, for each vulnerability, what's the likelihood, or are these vulnerabilities actively be exploiting now? What that all means is that when you add all of that together, we have a vast amount of data on the current threat landscape. So we know about, from the vulnerabilities, and we've been doing vulnerability management for over 20 years. So we've got the biggest kind of database of vulnerabilities anyway. And then we're starting to look at that through the lens of what's happening in the real world. How this hangs together technically. So the solution that delivers this, that sits at the top here, is something which we call Tenable Lumin. This is our cloud platform. So it's delivered software as a service. Underneath that, we can basically take feeds from two Tenable solutions. We have a cloud SaaS solution called Tenable.io, but we also have a very mature on-premise offering called Tenable.sc. So both of these vulnerability management platforms, Tenable.sc and Tenable.io, can feed up into Tenable Lumin to deliver our overall risk-based vulnerability management solution. Some customers use only the on-prem and then feed that up into the cloud. Some customers use Tenable.io, so a pure cloud play. Some customers use a combination of the two, right? We call it a hybrid model. below the vulnerability management platforms on-prem and in the cloud, and then we basically have a bunch of what we call sensors. So most people in the security world know Nessus. It's been around for well over 20 years. It is the de facto standard vulnerability scanning tool around because of its maturity. It's known to be the fastest, the most accurate, have the best vulnerability coverage. So that sits there, and that's the thing that can go and scan the network for vulnerabilities. But then we also have a bunch of other additional sensors to provide additional context. So we have something called Nessus Network Monitor that can analyze network traffic to passively identify devices on the network, but also to passively identify vulnerabilities. For example, we may see a vulnerable version of SSH being used on the network. We have agents that can be deployed where authenticated scans don't work or don't make sense. Agents are another viable option. An example there would be, we've seen it in the last 12 months due to the pandemic and the sudden increase in remote working. Customers have lots of endpoints sat out in people's homes. Now, network scans are never going to be able to pick those up. So therefore, agents are the best option for those types of devices. So that the agent can do its job in the background and then report back the data when the device connects to the back to the network. In fact, that device doesn't even need to be on the corporate network, right? It simply needs connectivity to the internet. We made an acquisition 18 months or so ago of a company called Indergy, which has provided us with a very robust and mature solution in the industrial security space, which we call Tenable.ot. That is very much targeted at those traditional industrial control type of assets. So the things that have been sat in a manufacturing plant, a factory, utilities, these things that are 20 plus years old as well, and relatively fragile devices. We have a very specific solution that can pull data from those and identify risks in those spaces without having to worry about traditional scanning in there, which can be problematic. We have a solution that can test container images prior to deployment. We're a PCI authorized scanning vendor, so we have a solution around PCI, and then we also have a web application scanning offering as well, looking at the OWASP top 10 type of risks. What all of that means is that we have very broad visibility into kind of all asset types, right? If you think about the traditional modern application stack, it will likely be comprised of containers running on a orchestrated platform, possibly in the cloud or possibly on something like Kubernetes, possibly a kind of a combination of the two, right, depending on whether you're looking at things like Amazon's various container services. But we can look at the containers, we can look at the Linux and the Windows platforms that those things are running on. And then finally, kind of at the top of that application stack, when you've got web applications, we can analyze those as well. So we can look for vulnerabilities and risk across that entire stack. And then on either side, we have a very broad integration strategy for ingesting third-party data where it makes sense, but also for exporting data to other systems. So things like CMDB systems, things like ticketing systems, governance, risk and compliance. So back to kind of this overall risk metric that we are providing for customers, we'll start to dive into the technical bits of how this works now. We're all about measuring cyber risk. And we do this by creating something which we call a cyber exposure score, which is an objective measure of risk derived through a data science-based approach, which fuses vulnerability data with threat intelligence and asset criticality. It creates a score between 1, least exposed, and 1,000, most exposed. We can trend this over time, which allows us to see how are we doing over time. Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? We also allow customers to compare their own cyber exposure score with the industry at large and that of their peers in the same industry verticals. We can apply this to kind of the overall organization, any asset, a specific asset in question, or a group of assets. So a typical use case there will be things like business units, where there are specific, people who are responsible for each business unit. They can see just their set of data without worrying about everyone else's. This is all about focusing on what matters first. And what we do is at a high level, we take 2 key data points together. First of all, we've created something called the vulnerability priority rating, which is an additional score over and above all the CVSS and various other vulnerability metrics that we have, that predicts the likelihood of a vulnerability being exploited based on real world risk. So this is part of that overall exposure AI model I talked about earlier, where we look at each vulnerability and we say, is this actively being exploited or not? Because what we've seen is, when we look back over the historical data, is you see that actually, when you look at CVSS scores, the vast majority of vulnerabilities disclosed are actually very often high and critical. And we say that when everything is critical, then realistically nothing is. And when we look at vulnerabilities and compare them, let's look at a couple of examples that I often use that came out a few years ago, but it's a nice example. They're both criticals. There was the missing MS-1710, the eternal blue, the specific vulnerability that WannaCry exploited. That was a CVSS critical. And then within the same, kind of year or so, the Spectre Meltdown vulnerabilities also, were disclosed, and they were also criticals. However, the Spectre Meltdown ones, but for the first kind of good year, probably longer, were very hypothetical, right? There was nobody really exploiting those. However, as we know what happened with WannaCry, there was a very prolific worm there that automated the exploitation of those. So they were both CVSS criticals. However, based on our threat intelligence, we could safely say that, you should be focusing on patching the WannaCry one first, right? And worry about the Spectre Meltdown one later. We're not saying you don't have to worry about it, but given limited time and resource, that's where you should focus first. And then what we then also do is we look at that through the lens of the asset criticality rating as well. So again, back to that example, you've got missing MS-1710 on two different assets in the environment. One is critical, one is not. We help you identify the critical asset, and then we tell you that this is the one that you should be focused on first. So the vulnerability priority rating is an additional score over and above the traditional CVSS metrics that we know, that takes into account threat recency. How have we seen activity targeting this specific vulnerability recently? How intense is that activity? Has there been lots of chatter, on the dark web about it? Are we seeing active malware campaigns around this? How exploitable is this? Is this something that is easily exploitable? It can be done remotely, or is it something that needs to be on the box? How old is the vulnerability? Is it something that's relatively new, or is it something that's been around for a long time? We tend to see that threat actors target older vulnerabilities, right? Not always the case. There have been some recent examples of the Exchange one that's popped up and suddenly been exploited. but very often, the threat actors are targeting the older vulnerabilities just simply because the exploit code is out there, it is known, it is mature. They have had more time to exploit that. And then we look at a bunch of threat sources. So again, chatter on the dark web. Are threat actors actively talking about these vulnerabilities? We put all of this together to give a score between 0 and 10 that highlights how likely this vulnerability is to be exploited. And then from an asset criticality standpoint, we automatically assign a criticality for every asset within an environment based on its business purpose, device type, connectivity, etc. And we do this automatically based on the scan data. So if we perform some credentialed scans across the environment, we can see, hey, here's a bunch of Windows servers running Oracle financial applications. So therefore, they are likely to be, they will be scored more important than a generic Windows workstation. We look at the connectivity. Are these do these devices have public IP addresses? Are they exposed to the internet? If they are, their criticality is pushed up. Are they internal? Their criticality is pushed down. But crucially, we can also take a third-party feed, because we're not going to get that right all of the time, right? The feedback we hear from our customers is that we are close to getting a good asset criticality out of the box about 80% of the time. But of course, there will be specific environments where we can't work, we simply don't have the data, or even out of those bunch of Oracle financial boxes that I mentioned before, one of those really is important because of the data that it holds, and we won't necessarily be able to see that. But if you have a third-party system, a CMDB or any kind of asset register that says these are the critical devices, we can take a feed of that data into the platform to say these ones are critical. What that does is that the output of that is a number, which we call the cyber exposure score, which we'll look into shortly. What we also allow organizations to do is then to compare their cyber exposure score with the industry at large and their peers in their vertical. So let's take, for example, I look after the finance vertical in the UK. So we have customers that leverage this and can then compare their score with that of their peers in the financial services vertical. And then they can then see, well, actually, we are doing better than our peers, or we're doing worse than our peers. And that enables then further business level conversations to take place to identify, why is that? Maybe we have resource issues. Maybe we don't have the right processes in place. Maybe we need more tools. We also provide remediation guidance, so recommended actions. This really helps answer the question of, what do I fix first? Most people who have run a vulnerability scan with either Nessus or with any other well-known vulnerability tool find they're quickly overwhelmed with the sheer amount of the vulnerabilities that come back. And then the solution to those can vary. Very often, the solution to fixing a vulnerability is to patch, right? The remediation guidance gives you advice on, well, if you apply this patch or specific patches, it will remediate the most amounts of vulnerabilities and will reduce the most amounts of risk. We also measure and score you on your assessment maturity, which takes into account scan frequency and scan depth. So if you are scanning only once a month and you're not doing much in the way of authenticated scanning, your assessment maturity grade will not be very good. What we need to be driving customers to do is to scan frequently and to scan deep. So regular authenticated scanning. That's the only way that gives you the visibility and the useful and accurate data on really what does our current risk look like. We also grade you on your remediation maturity, which is around process integrity. So this allows you to map SLAs into the platform. So maybe you have an SLA that says we will patch critical vulnerabilities within 30 days. We allow you to track that and say, well, actually, you're meeting that, or your mean time to patch and remediate critical vulnerabilities is actually over 30 days. So we provide you that information as well. So what we can do now is dive into a demo which actually walks through these key points. And of course, I've timed out. So when we come into our default dashboard, this screen helps to highlight the numbers problem that everybody who runs a vulnerability scan quickly finds themselves up against. So just in this demo environment with a relatively small number of assets, 863, right? It's not a huge amount. We see that there are 37,000 unique vulnerabilities. Now, historical compliance-driven type of approaches say, yeah, we recognize this, right? So you just fix the highs and the criticals, right? But even in that environment, we've still got over 16,000 highs and criticals. And this isn't taking asset criticality into account as well, right? This is just looking at CVSS, highs and criticals. So for most organizations, a typical organization with 863 assets will probably be lucky if they've got one full-time person focused on vulnerability management, right? More than likely, for a typical organization with 800 odd assets, there'll probably be a couple of people that look after this, but we'll have to look after vulnerability management plus all the other security tooling as well. So they're not going to be dedicated to this. So then when we start to look at how do we prioritize fixing these 16,000 things? So first of all, we can start to leverage our vulnerability priority rating. So the obvious place to start there would be anything with a vulnerability priority rating of 9 and above, and there are just over 2,500 of those. That would be a good place to start. So there, out of those 37,000 vulnerabilities, there were 2,700 that are Tenable are saying, these are the vulnerabilities that are actively being exploited right now, whether it be via malware, nation state threat actors, just general bad guys on the internet, right? These are the ones that we're seeing threat activity based around. So based on our knowledge of what's happening in the world, that whole exposure AI platform, every night we go through. So this number could change as well, right? And it will change over time. It won't change dramatically, but you could see that out of these criticals, there's 2,724. If I hover over this today, that number might be a little over that tomorrow. It might be a little bit below it, depending on what's happening and how things change. This is still a challenge, which is where our Lumin solution comes in. This is where we start to provide this overall risk score. Now, the overall risk score for the organization in this example environment, 640, at a high level, that is quite a simple calculation. It's an average of the score for every single asset. So what we do is we actually create what we call an asset exposure score for every single asset within the environment. That's simply an average of that. We allow you to trend that over time. So we can see Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? What we tend to find is that a lot of organizations run around, their vulnerability management teams are busy. Every Microsoft Patch Tuesday rolls around and they run around trying to patch all the, all the highs and the criticals. So yes, they are patching and they are addressing vulnerabilities and they are busy. However, they may be ignoring the medium vulnerabilities that have been around in the organization for a lot longer, which are potentially the ones that are actively being exploited because they're not taking into account the threat activity. So what they would say is if you run around and you just do the patch all the criticals every Patch Tuesday, you will be busy, but you may not be reducing risk. This helps to see, are we reducing risk over time? We allow you to compare yourself. In this demo environment, it's a hypothetical public services organization. And in the real world, you would be in whatever vertical. If you're a bank, you'd be in financial services, for example. How do we compare to our peers? And how do we compare to the population at large? Are we better or worse? We give you your trend, trending up in the last 14 days. So we're not necessarily reducing risk. At an organizational level, we answer that question of where do I start first? So by looking at the top recommended actions, we can say that these top recommended actions, if you apply these, you would reduce your risk score by 5 and eliminate 129,000 unique vulnerabilities across 390 assets. And you can click on here and you get a high level kind of top 20 or so. Sometimes it's a bit less depending on the environment, but a high level kind of top 20 things that you should go and fix right now, looking across the organization. And if we click on one of these, we can start to drill down that applying that patch will address these 10 CVEs. And we can see that one of these has a VPR scoring of 10. Interestingly, this is one that has a CVSS v2 score that's lower, but based on what we've seen threat activity recently, and it's quite an old vulnerability. So this is one of those examples that's been around for quite a while, that it's a low CVSS vulnerability. It very often gets prioritized below. It's quite old, it's been well known, so the bad guys know how to exploit this. We've seen threat activity that says, well, actually, even though CVSS v2 says this is probably medium, Tenable has seen activity that says that this should be a higher priority for you to fix. And we tell you which 197 assets that is on. And here we can start to see the asset criticality as well. So these asset criticality boxes of 8, again, the higher the asset criticality would be the obvious ones to start fixing there as well. We can get a similar view per business context. So again, in this environment, we've broken down the environment by example business units. But I've seen customers base this on technology, Windows, Linux, seen it based on kind of application service. Maybe there's a customer facing environment that has a bunch of web servers, a bunch of backend database servers, so a bunch of servers that form a specific, business function. Seen it based on geography. We create a score per business unit and trend that score over time as well. And again, that allows organizations to go, well, why does finance have a worse score 621 than cloud development? And then we can then drill into that and see the details on what's happening within finance. And again, it allows us to start asking these questions as we move forwards. What is different in finance versus cloud development? Do they have, are they running different tooling, different processes? Maybe they have more people and more resource. So that could be something to do with it. Again, we see the trend within that unit. We see the breakdown of the asset criticality. We see a breakdown of how our scans are authenticated versus unauthenticated, what our scan frequency is like. And again, we allow you to look at, well, how do we compare to the population at large in terms of scan frequency and our peers? And actually in here, we're not doing too badly. We've got a scan frequency of on average every 1 to 7 days. I think if we look at maybe another example. There we go. We can see in this environment, we are doing more authenticated scanning in this particular environment. So, you know, that could be a reason that their score is better. You know, we have more accurate, we have more high fidelity data, and we take into account some of these other metrics in terms of creating this score. Generally, you want to be doing authenticated scanning as much as possible. Now, within this environment, we again provide a solutions view. So for each asset, we create what we call an asset exposure score. So these are the high risk assets. So the asset exposure score is based on a function of the vulnerabilities and the asset criticality. So again, within this environment, or within this business context, these would be the 20 solutions that Tenable would recommend that you fix. Because that knocks out these vulnerabilities across these assets. And some of these assets are relatively high. 8s would be the higher asset criticality. We also provide visibility into what's happening in the real world right now. So cyber exposure alerts. So this view shows us how our assets are affected based on the current headline of vulnerabilities. For example, there was the recent Microsoft Exchange vulnerability that was disclosed that got a lot of coverage in the press. There was, get the details, a vast amount of Exchange servers were compromised very quickly. You can click on that and you can get full information on our research. We have the largest research team of any vulnerability management vendor in the industry, and we provide lots of research and background information like this on our website that tells you what's happening, what the problem is, how you need to fix it, etc. Crucially, we can click on here and we can see which of our assets are affected. Those are the CVEs. So we've built a query out of the box for you that looks for those specific CVEs. And then here are the assets in your environment that are vulnerable to those CVEs. So based on that current problem, again, this is something that you should definitely be focusing on fixing right now. And this is dynamic. This will change. So that's what's in here at the moment. There's the recent Microsoft Patch Tuesday, the recent proxy logging issues. This is the most recent one, actually, I think, for VMware. Yeah, published on March the 30th, right? That's only just over a week ago, based on, you know, the current date being the 8th of April. And this will change. There could be something else in here next week, depending on what happens in the real world. We grade you overall on your assessment maturity as well, and remediation maturity. So at a high level, assessment maturity, this is all around the depth than the frequency of your scanning percent. We give you a grade and a score based on that. In this example, not too bad, a score of B for depth. So based on doing a good amount of authenticated scanning. Frequency grade of B, based on scanning fairly frequently. And again, we give you some information, some best practices. Tenable best practice: scan at least twice a week with authenticated scanning. Scan more often to get to a grade A. Remediation maturity, similar scoring and grading based on how you remediate vulnerabilities. So maybe we have an SLA that says we will patch our critical vulnerabilities within 30 days. However, our average time to remediate critical vulnerabilities is 60 days. So in this example, this is one of the reasons why we are getting a D. If we compare that to our peers, the average is 14 days. The average across the entire population, 12 days. So in this particular example, we're scanning frequently. We're doing authenticated scanning. However, there is something wrong in our vulnerability management process, which means we are not remediating as quickly as everybody else and not within our SLAs. So this would start to highlight process issues. So maybe the team responsible for doing the remediation is under-resourced, under-tooled, etc. It's starting to highlight those process issues. And again, that's up here as a recommended action right there, front and center. You're taking an average of 60 days, reduce this time to 14 days to match the industry average. Finally, we provide information on mitigations detected within the environment. So currently we're focused on endpoint type tools. So things like the antivirus, next-gen antivirus, the EDR vendors. We will identify from our scan data how many systems actually have those in place. And so what we can see here is not out of all of those assets, only 3.7% have those mitigations in place. Now, clearly not all of those are going to require that. But let's say we have a corporate standard that says all of our Windows workstations, should have AV of a specific vendor. This allows us to then start drilling into that data and say, well, actually, we have gaps. We have workstations where our mitigations are not in place. As we move forwards, we'll start to leverage this in the risk scoring as well, so that having mitigations and having antivirus in place where it should be can help to reduce your overall score. But in summary, today, only Tenable can provide a quantifiable and measurable cyber exposure score that allows business leaders to measure their risk. There we go. Done, Peter. You still there?
Great, fantastic. Right. Thank you, Gary. Very informative. I do have a question. What you've just shown us here, was that some kind of demo version that is open to others?
So this is not this is a Tenable demo. We do have demo platforms for our partners. Customers, we don't have an open demo platform, but we can absolutely enable a proof of concept trial for end users.
Okay, that's great. So basically, that enables any curious customer to give it a try.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. In the interest of time, Gary, I thank you very much. It's been fantastic, and I think this was a very, very good and nice presentation. We will be posting it, the recording, very, very soon. So by that, I will close this session right now.